by God, yet being abandoned in the middle of a desert with no hope for survival. This is the shocking story of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, who, in an instant, saw his life drastically change. How would you react if everything you knew was taken from you so cruelly? In this video, you will discover how Ishmael, a young man doomed to be forgotten, turned despair into strength and the inhospitable desert into his home. A story full of twists, betrayals, and miracles, revealing the surprising ways fate can change when all seems lost. If you're curious to find out how Ishmael overcame impossible challenges and transformed his fate, keep watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and leave a like so you don't miss any of the upcoming inspiring stories from the Bible. Get ready to embark on a journey of pain, resilience, and above all, hope, which still teaches us powerful lessons about faith and overcoming. Once upon a time, in a distant land, there was a man named Abraham. He was a man of faith, dedicated and loyal to his God. From a young age, Abraham believed in the divine promises, which assured him that he would be the father of a great nation. However, as the years passed, the promise of a son seemed ever more distant. Time, relentless as always, left its marks on his face and on the heart of his wife, Sarah. Abraham was an elderly man, and Sarah, his companion through long journeys, also felt the weight of the years. The hope of holding a son in their arms seemed an increasingly distant dream. The nights, which were once filled with conversations about the future, now became moments of heavy silence. Deep down, both wondered if time had stolen their chance to see the promise fulfilled. One day, while gazing at the stars, Abraham once again heard the voice of God, as soft as the whisper of the wind. The promise was reaffirmed. He would be the father of descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham, without understanding the paths that fate was drawing, remained steadfast in his faith. But the uncertainty about when this promise would be fulfilled continued to haunt him. Sarah, for her part, could no longer contain her distress. The looks exchanged between the couple reflected the pain of an endless wait. Sarah increasingly felt the weight of the unfulfilled promise. The days passed slowly, and with each new wrinkle that appeared on her face, a new worry blossomed in her heart. She knew that, although Abraham's faith was unshakable, time seemed to be against them. The silent nights became moments of reflection, and Sarah, in her heart, began to plan a desperate solution. One morning, as the golden light of the sun flooded the tent, Sarah approached Abraham. Her eyes, which had seen so much over the years, now carried a restless glimmer. She spoke with a firm voice, but laden with contained sadness. "Abraham, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Please, take my servant Hagar. Perhaps through her, I can build a family." These words, simple and direct, hit a whirlwind of emotions. Sarah knew she was proposing something out of the ordinary, but the pain of waiting and the desire to fulfill the promise they so longed for was greater. Abraham, after a brief hesitation, accepted his wife's request, aware that this decision was laden with deep meanings. Hagar, the young Egyptian servant, was summoned and informed of her new role. Without a voice in the decision, she found herself suddenly at the center of a plot larger than she could have imagined. What seemed a temporary solution actually planted the seeds of a future filled with challenges and conflicts. The silence inside Hagar's tent was dense, almost palpable. The young servant, who had until then lived in the shadow of her masters, now found herself in an unexpected situation. She carried in her womb the future son of Abraham, the patriarch to whom God had promised numerous descendants. Each movement inside her, each new symptom of pregnancy, seemed to echo a profound and irreversible change. What was once merely a role as a servant, now transformed into a direct connection with the fate of a nation. As the months passed, Hagar's pregnancy became evident, and with it, something new and unsettling began to sprout in her heart. Hagar, who had previously kept her eyes down in respect and submission, now felt a growing sense of pride. She, the servant, was giving the great Abraham the son that Sarah could never have. The irony of this situation did not escape her. The servant now carried the future in her arms, and this gave her a subtle but undeniable power. However, this change did not go unnoticed by Sarah. The servant's gaze, previously humble, now carried a spark of defiance, a shadow of superiority that Sarah could not ignore. The tension between the two women grew day by day, like a rope about to snap. What had started as a solution to the problem of infertility now created a new wound in the relationship between Sarah and Abraham. The tension in Abraham's tent was almost unbearable. Sarah, who had initially made the decision to offer her servant to her husband with a heart full of hope, now found herself tormented by feelings she couldn't control. Every look from Hagar, every gesture of the young servant who carried Abraham's child, was like a spark that ignited her soul. The silent pride emanating from Hagar was a constant reminder of what Sarah could not have. The weight of this reality turned into bitter resentment. What was once a solution to the lack of an heir had become a poison running through Sarah's veins. She began to treat Hagar coldly, trying somehow to rebalance the scales that had been so cruelly tipped against her. But each attempt to reaffirm her position in the family seemed only to fuel the flame of her own frustration. The servant, once invisible, now occupied a place Sarah never imagined would be out of her reach. As Hagar's belly grew, Sarah's resentment intensified, like a storm forming on the horizon. The nights of silence between Sarah and Abraham became even longer, laden with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. Abraham, though aware of the growing tension, seemed powerless to dispel the dark clouds that hovered over his family. And so, with the weight of resentment between the two women increasing day by day, Hagar, feeling the hostility around her, began to think about fleeing. Hagar could no longer bear it. The growing tension in Abraham's tent had become an unbearable burden. Sarah's cold gaze, the cutting words that slipped from her lips, and the oppressive atmosphere forming around her left her suffocated. Each day was a silent battle, and each night a nightmare that seemed endless. Desperate, Hagar decided she could no longer endure the torment. One early morning, while the camp was still enveloped in the quiet darkness of the desert, Hagar made a decision that would change the course of her life. Quietly, she gathered the little she owned and left the tent where she had served for so many years. The cold night wind wrapped around her as she walked, carrying only the child growing in her womb and the pain in her heart. Hagar headed into the desert, a place where she hoped to find some peace away from judgmental stares and the tensions of the camp. But the desert, with its vastness and silence, soon proved to be as relentless as the environment she had left behind. The heat of the sun scorched her skin, and the lack of water and food quickly turned her escape into a desperate act. Her feet, already injured, sank into the hot sand, and the weight of the pregnancy made each step more difficult. When it seemed her strength had run out, Hagar stopped to rest by a spring in the desert, the Well of Shur. There, alone and exhausted, she began to cry, her tears mixing with the desert dust. But then, in the midst of that absolute silence, a soft and heavenly voice called her by name. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where do you come from, and where are you going?" Surprised, Hagar looked up and encountered a radiant figure, a celestial messenger. It was an angel of the Lord. His words, though gentle, carried a profound weight, and Hagar felt she was in the presence of something far greater than anything she had ever experienced. Trembling, she shared her story, spoke of her suffering, of Sarah's persecution, and of the anguish that had driven her to flee to that hostile desert. The angel, hearing her lament, spoke with a tenderness that contrasted with the harshness of the life Hagar had faced. "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hands." These words, though harsh at first glance, were accompanied by a grand promise. The angel continued, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." And then the final revelation. The son Hagar carried would be named Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord had heard her affliction. Hagar, still processing everything she had heard, felt a new strength arise within her. She was no longer alone. God had seen her pain and promised a future for the son she carried. With a lighter heart and a clear mission, Hagar decided to return to the tent of Abraham and Sarah. She knew the days ahead would be challenging, but now there was a divine promise guiding her steps. And so, under the scorching sun of the desert, Hagar began her journey back with Ishmael, the child of promise, growing in her womb. The years passed, and Abraham's camp was filled again with an unexpected energy. Sarah finally had her own encounter with the impossible. News spread like wildfire. Sarah, in her old age, had conceived a son. Laughter that was once of disbelief turned into laughter of joy, for God had fulfilled his promise. The boy was named Isaac, which means laughter, a living testimony that, even at an advanced age, the impossible could happen. But as Sarah cradled little Isaac in her arms, her thoughts inevitably turned to Abraham's first son, Ishmael, now a young man. With Isaac's birth, a new light shone on Abraham's tent, but it also cast longer shadows, one of which hovered over Ishmael. Sarah, watching the two boys together, began to notice something that unsettled her. There was a glint in Ishmael's eyes that she couldn't decipher, something between scorn and indifference. It was as if, in every gesture, every look, he reminded everyone that before Isaac, he was the firstborn, the first to receive Abraham's affection and attention. The laughter that once united the family now began to echo differently. The rivalry between the two half-brothers grew silently, like a flame lit at the bottom of a well. Sarah, in her heart, began to feel a growing fear, an unrest that kept her vigilant during the long and silent nights. She knew that Isaac's birth was just the beginning of a new phase, and that Ishmael's presence would bring unexpected challenges. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, now a teenager, observed the growth of his half-brother Isaac with a mix of curiosity and resentment. Since little Isaac had come into the world, it seemed that the sun shone only for him. Abraham, who had previously given all his attention to Ishmael, now divided his time between the firstborn and the new heir. Ishmael felt this change as an open wound, something he could not ignore. One day, during a celebration in honor of Isaac's weaning, Ishmael could no longer contain what was simmering inside him. While everyone laughed and celebrated, the youth, with an expression that mixed challenge and disdain, mocked Isaac. It was a brief laugh, but loaded with deep meanings that cut through the air like a blade. That laughter, a sound that should have been light and unpretentious, echoed like bitter irony. It was as if Ishmael, through that seemingly simple gesture, was reclaiming his place, reminding everyone that he was the first, Abraham's firstborn. Sarah, who watched everything with keen eyes, felt a pang of anguish in her chest. That moment, so brief and seemingly insignificant, reignited her greatest fears. She knew that although Isaac was the son of the promise, Ishmael carried within him a strength that could not be ignored. Ishmael's laughter, far from being just a brotherly joke, was a harbinger of something deeper, a tension that grew silently like a storm forming on the horizon. The peace in Abraham's tent was threatened. Sarah, with a heavy heart, knew she could no longer ignore what was happening. Something needed to be done, and this conviction grew within her, like a shadow that could not be dispelled. The tension in Abraham's tent reached an unsustainable point. Sarah, driven by a mix of fear and determination, finally approached Abraham with a difficult and relentless decision. "This boy, Ishmael, shall not inherit with my son Isaac," she declared, her voice firm but her heart in turmoil. She knew that those words, once spoken, could not be taken back, but also knew that the peace and future of Isaac were at stake. Abraham, upon hearing Sarah's request, felt his heart weigh like never before. Ishmael